welcome, friends. I'm Doug Haney, Executive Director of Polyphony Music Resources. And today, our guest is Joe Stovall. Joe is Senior Pastor at University Park United Methodist Church in Dallas, Texas. Welcome, Joe. So glad to have you in this conversation today.
Well, thank you, Doug. I appreciate the warm welcome, and I'm really blessed and honored to be a part of this conversation and to be part of your wonderful work. And it's an evergreen phenomenon we're talking about today. So I'm excited to be
Absolutely,
part of it.
absolutely. This is really the second sort of part two of a two-part video series on pastor church musician working relationships. Our first video featured Ann Jernberg Scalfaro, who is pastor at Calvary Baptist Church in Denver, and Andy Stoker, pastor at Central United Methodist Church in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And if you've not seen that video, you might go look for it on our Polyphony YouTube channel. Well, I'll give credit to Andy for introducing me to you, Joe. And I'm so glad we could make this happen today because as I discovered more about your story, I thought what a fantastic opportunity for someone who at one time was a church musician and now is a senior pastor to speak about both of these roles. So could you just tell us a little bit about your background and maybe just briefly how you came to be senior pastor at University Park?
Yes, there are some times when I walk out of the building or walk to the church and go like, man, how did this happen? Yeah, so just super quick background about myself. I did my undergraduate at the University of North Texas in music.
Right.
I was a saxophonist at concentration, but took a lot of like choral conducting classes and vocal
Okay.
choral ed because I knew I was headed into church music. That was my calling. And so I did an MSN degree, a Master's of Sacred Music degree from the Perkins School of
Right.
Theology. And
All
I'm a
right.
United Methodist deacon. And so I was felt this twin calling to church music and also to a relationship as a member of the clergy with the annual conference. And so that's been, I've always kind of had a foot in each of those worlds. And then as I went through, served in a variety of different locations in Texas, from ex-urban to county seat to
Okay.
downtown to suburban. And in my last appointment, which was in Frisco, I had this, Frisco, Texas, I had this, I guess I'd call it a conversion experience, really, in which I really felt that God was calling me to love God's people in this new way,
Wow.
in this new role, and
Okay.
not that, not better at all, just something different, and that
Right.
was this new thing. And so I was fortunate to be able to, in the church that I was serving in, to be able to move over to pastoring two of the services there, and it went really, really well.
Nice.
And then I got a call from my bishop, not that much farther away, asking me to serve in this new context. And that my seating was supposed to be, it was the Sunday that everything shut down because of COVID. So that's a whole nother story. But
Oh,
learning to,
wow. Yeah.
yeah, learning to be a senior pastor in COVID at a church of the size and breadth and depth of University Park was a little
Right.
bit like sitting down for your first piano lesson and like, all right, we're going to play this Beethoven sonata and you know,
And at Carnegie Hall or something?
yeah, yeah. Middle C's here. Good luck, you know.
Yikes. Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you for that bit of background. I think
Sure.
it's going to be really fascinating to talk with you because you've got that you've got um, a bifocal perspective on these roles that I think will be really valuable to us as we unpack this. Let me just step back and say if a viewer did not see our first video, the focus on this comes directly out of some research, some qualitative research that Polyphony conducted, where over the last two summers, 2022 and 2023, we interviewed 100 church musicians across the country, different stages, early stage, sort of early stage, mid career, late career church musicians, various denominations. And the big question we ask is as you look at the decade ahead, what do you need to flourish in your work? And one of the takeaways, one of our findings, probably not surprising, is that church musicians said, in order to flourish in my work, I need a positive, productive working relationship with the team, with the staff, but especially the senior pastor. So today, the goal of our conversation is to talk a little bit about what does that look like? What does a positive, productive working relationship look like and feel like for church musician and pastor? So let me just start with this kind of a general broad question for you. What is the role of music and worship in the life of a congregation? How important is this? I'll pitch you a softball to start.
Okay, very good. Yeah, that's a great question, and I think one that we probably ought to be asking ourselves annually, at least. What are we doing, and are we doing the
Mhm.
things we think we're doing? For me, and obviously as a church musician for 2 decades, I have a pretty strong bias in this direction. I recognize that, but I think the role of music and worship in a congregation and the life of a congregation is and has incredible potential to be transformative.
Mm.
There's so many different things that music is a part of: prayer, praise, lament.
Yes.
It's all of these things. And as I used to tell um, the preachers that I worked with when I was a full-time church musician, which I now tell myself, is that like, look, man,
I love
keep
it.
it keep it tight, right? Like people can remember the first stanza of Amazing Grace, but in 10 years, most likely they're 10 years, in 15 minutes, most likely they're not going to remember much past the main point of the homily.
I have a colleague from another state who used to say regularly about that very thing. It's hard to be bad if you're brief.
That's right. Yes, yes, yes. And
Although
it's
I have such admiration for the art and craft of preaching. But go ahead.
Yeah, me too. And I think they can work together very well. I mean, I think clearly we are called by God to worship individually, certainly, but primarily as a community. And I've
Mm.
always been in love and enamored with the way music and ritual can strengthen our communities. And I think right now in the United States, I'd probably Western civilization in general, we're in a really, really critical juncture of the health of the church and frankly the polis, right? We live in this neo-capitalist culture and worldview that tells us that our ultimate satisfaction as individuals, the telos of a good life, what does it mean to live a good life, is meeting all our needs via consumption. And the gospel message is obviously very different than that. And so I think corporate worship can really be part of the antidote to that poisonous way of thinking. I remember at the turn of the century, Robert Putnam had that great book, Bowling
Yeah.
Alone. And
Right. Right.
yes, he's got
Fascinating.
fascinating book that the basic premise was that there are more people bowling in the United States than ever before and less bowling leagues than ever before. And he's got a follow-up documentary coming out in the next month called Join
Really?
or Die. And the premise is that you can save America and democracy by joining a club, by getting into community of some sort. And I think there's
Wow.
really a lot to that. And so I think in corporate worship,
Mm.
music has that potential along with ritual and especially the magic that happens when they're combined artistically
Right.
uh,
Right.
to unite us. I think even congregational singing, right? Like we have those great studies of choirs and how we synchronize our breathing and our heart
Right.
rates. And I mean, when I was in a full-time pastoral musician, for me, the congregation song is the most important song of them all.
Right.
And as a clergy person, as a senior pastor, that's still the case. I look at the choir, the body as our big choir, and so to me, everything is pretty much subservient to that
Right.
music standpoint. Not to say that introits and anthems and masterworks are not important; they're really important.
Sure, sure,
Yeah,
absolutely.
I think those
Yeah.
things can.
But I mean, to be a pastor or church musician who can have the savvy and the understanding to understand what what works in your context for those people, not for a generic group of people, but
Yes.
for those people. What can they sing? What can they sing well? We could digress, but keep going. I love it. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. Well, I think those things too have the real power to open up the windows in people's soul to let the Holy Spirit come in and do her thing and point us to the new thing that God is doing in our midst. And I think God's always doing something. And music gives us the ability to, I think, unlock our imaginations a little bit,
Mm.
to open us up to the work of the Spirit. So, yes, obviously pretty biased, but I think the role of music and worship is critical. Now, I've been to some other churches where the music and worship wasn't maybe technically really good, but the hospitality more than made up for it. So each
Okay.
church
Yeah.
has
Yeah.
their own
Sure.
character,
Sure.
right?
Sure.
But
Right.
wouldn't it
Right.
be great if we could have all of those things? I think we can.
Yeah. Yeah. It's something to aspire to for sure.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. 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 Well, shifting gears just a little
Yep.
bit, tell our listeners a little bit about what you wish church musicians could understand about your role as senior pastor and as the senior pastor in the context of a staff and congregational system.
Sure. Sure. Sure.
But
Yeah.
that's really different now, the seat in which you now sit.
Yes. Yeah, a church musician friend asked me a year into my role as a senior pastor at University Park, and he said, "Well, which job's more stressful?" And I said, "They're both really stressful, but in
Okay.
very different ways.
Okay.
In the
Ah,
sense that, I guess to answer the question specifically, I think one of the things that I wish church musicians would be able to have kind of a feel for, could understand as for the role of their clergy siblings, is that it's a very heavy weight,
mm,
especially the role of a senior leader. I had the fortune of being a associate pastor who preached
okay.
every week, and that was a great gig because I could say whatever I wanted. I could take whatever stand I wanted to take, and I didn't have to pay the price of like not making payroll that month.
Oh, oh, oh.
So we had a massive flood in my first year at UP that cost $3 million in damage, and like the weight of all of that is really heavy.
Oh
And
my.
I think it's especially, I think for all of us in every ministry area, these are just really liminal times, right? We're not what we used
Yeah.
to be. We're not what we're going to be. We're in some in between place, and there's a lot of weight that comes to that. So so I think that's one thing. I think
Okay.
the other thing that I didn't learn really until a little later in my music ministry career was about the way in which it can be easy to project our anxieties or onto the senior leader in our own areas, from our own areas.
Okay.
Um, and so I think it's really easy to think, well, why isn't the senior pastor talking with me about this small detail that I really want their input on? And the senior leader is having to do that with every person, that reports to them. So I think sometimes it can feel like they're not getting the attention they deserve, which is true, they deserve it. But like in a healthy system, hopefully a senior leader is got their eyes on the whole board, and of which music and worship is a very important part of a
Mhm.
very complex organism.
Mm.
So I think that's something. I think the other thing a couple things I would say was, and this is what I meant to say that I didn't learn until later, but I realized they were connected. Emails, for example, I used to craft as a church musician like these at one church that I was in, these like almost beautifully scholarly emails with footnotes and stuff, for the senior pastor. And like it took me 6 months to realize I kept getting irritated that he wouldn't get back to me. And I realized now that I'm in the role, oh, you don't have time for that. So sometimes brevity is really helpful in being in relationship with each other. The other thing, if I could just keep going, I think
Sure. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I think it's important for folks to, when I say folks, I mean
yeah.
our cohort of
Mhm.
church musicians, to for you to pull back the curtain a
Sure.
little bit and let them know what it now is like to be in that unique, that different role as
Yes.
senior pastor. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, the web of connection is significantly larger. And I was a clergy person when I was a church musician, so I always had pastoral work as well. But
Okay.
being a senior leader, it's the whole thing.
Mm.
And I think a piece of that is that sometimes I know I was guilty of thinking this, that, well, the senior pastor just needs to stand up and like make a change, needs to stand up and do this thing and make this change. And I think a wise senior leader rarely, if ever, makes changes by fiat alone, right? If we're
Okay.
mindful of the overall health of the community that we've been entrusted to shepherd along with our staff, rather than grabbing most people by the nose and dragging them to where we think that we're supposed to be, we've got a real opportunity to build consensus and to cast a vision that is compelling enough to people to move in a way that gets us to where we want to be over the long run. So sometimes it's very tempting, I think, as an Enneagram 3, someone who values efficiency to a fault, that I'm really working to value humanity
I
and
see. Sure.
discernment
Sure.
and
Yeah.
process. And so
Yeah.
sometimes things look easy on one side. Well, if Joe would just say this, or Joe would
Uh-huh.
just do this, then we wouldn't have that problem. But I'm looking at a different way of being altogether, right?
Mm.
So and I also think sometimes we assume that pastors have a lot of power that maybe they really don't. Like in the United Methodist system, I am the co-chair of one committee. That's it. Nominations, which is the right committee to be a co-chair of. Then when it comes to the building, the only place where I could do things just by sheer will would be the sanctuary. Everything else is up to the lay folks. So I think it's easy to just think, oh, well, the leader can just pull the switch and it's done. And it really, if you're being wise, it doesn't really work quite that way.
Yeah, yeah, I've heard pastor friends, and I have many, by the way,
Yeah.
who talk about pastoral sensibility.
Mm-hmm.
Just that's that wisdom that comes with the office. You know when to act and when not to act, when to be patient, but when it's time to decide and move forward. And yeah, that requires certainly the nudgings of the spirit and the bravery of I don't even know what the word is.
I
But
think you said it really well. That was the like the discernment to know when to hold back, and then when it's time to make a decision, you make it and move.
yeah,
And yeah, hopefully, I appreciate you think that the wisdom comes with the office.
yeah. Well,
Hopefully, at
yeah,
least we
no,
super open,
indeed.
we learn it on the way, right?
Sure. Well, talking a little bit more about this this working relationship that exists, and we've all seen sort of the good, the bad, and the ugly
Yes.
of these things. So no point. I don't think it's really productive to recount that per se, but thinking aspirationally, at least, how do you as leader create a culture where both pastor and church musician can flourish in
Yeah.
their work?
Well, I think it's a critical task. I know I had several folks, elders, who's in my system, who were like senior pastors, who reached out to me, just with a little bit of advice when I was making the transition, and to a person like, like on staff, if you're not good with the music minister, you're in trouble. To which I want to say, like,
Oh,
I did
really?
for like 20 years, right? Oh yeah, totally.
No, are you making this up? You
No,
mean you really had
not at
people
all.
pull you aside before you
Oh
took
yeah.
on the new position? Okay,
Yes.
isn't that interesting?
Yeah. So I think that's hopeful mostly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just pull the curtain too far back, but I have two weekly scheduled one-to-one meetings, and I meet every week with our music minister and every week with our preschool director
Oh,
and day school director. And I look
okay.
forward to both of them. They're highlights of my week, and we
Great.
just chance to talk about all the things. And sort of the way I treat the one-on-ones is, it's your time. If it's helpful to meet, we'll meet, and you tell me what we're talking about. And
Okay. Gotcha.
it's just
All
I
right.
try to keep as much of an open door for the staff and certainly the musicians as possible, because I think we're really like the good starting point in any relationship, right, is to treat each other with humanity and dignity and respect.
Right.
I think I don't know why that's hard for Christians to do sometimes. It does feel
Mm.
like the basis of what we're supposed to be about as followers of Jesus, but I think that piece right there is huge, is like, we need to be able to be together as people and to really listen to one another, to seek to understand where people are coming from and what is underneath that. My experience often, when we get really irritated about something with someone, there's something running in the background of the
Mhm.
conversation, as they say in family systems, like the thing is not the thing.
Right. Uh-huh.
Mhm.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And I think when we get a precondition for a healthy relationship, I think, is knowing that we are going to disagree from time to time, uh,
Mm.
and that's okay. And that if we really understand each other well, we can disagree well. So I think that's a big piece of it. Really, not rehearsing in our conversations, right? In the sense
Mhm.
of, like, when we're talking, I'm really trying to listen to what the musician I'm working with is saying. Um, and that's one of the challenges as it being a professional church musician. Is like sometimes I have what I think where I think he's going is not where he's going, and most of the time where he's going is better than what I was thinking. So I think there's
Mm.
humility from the senior pastor is also really important in that. That even though I think the senior pastor sits in a seat that if they're engaged well with their system, they're going to see the whole of the chessboard. They also can't always see how it's really working on the ground well.
Mm.
And really, as senior pastors, we've got to trust our staff, got to
Right.
trust our.
Well, and to underscore the word trust, I'll speak to myself.
Hmm.
I was very fortunate over decades of serving as a church musician in some wonderful places that I had working relationships that were on a spectrum of, I would say, good to great, and
Yes.
never toxic or terrible. I was very fortunate.
Mm.
But what I would add to what you just said is, I love it that you're doing these one-to-ones with your church musician and your preschool director, and you're making all of these little deposits in relationship and in trust, and but trust really takes time, right?
It does.
And uh, and we do know from sort of worst case scenarios that trust can vanish overnight
Hmm.
unless you have a pretty big, to go back to sort of Stephen Covey, if you have a big bank account of trust, you can take a withdrawal on it and your
Right.
relationship will be okay. But if
Yes.
there's no trust, it can run a deficit really quickly.
Yes. And like any kind of debt, that's hard to get out of.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah,
I think so much of that too is just being willing to. That sounds like being a human 101, but like you build
yeah,
that by spending time with people and be
yeah.
genuinely interested. What's going on with their family life?
Mm.
What's happening with their parents? How are their kids doing? Yeah, I think that's one of the joys that folks who have the privilege of working on a church staff is that like, there is actually time for these conversations. You know?
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, you're absolutely right. Well, also creating this is actually a good transition to sort of my next question. In creating a culture where everyone flourishes, our research told us that most church musicians, at least the ones we interviewed, our sample set, they wanted they defined that flourishing as some sort of collaboration. From your perspective, Joe, how does collaboration in working relationship and worship design happen at your place? I think that folks would be interested to
Yeah,
know.
sure. For me, it's always in motion. So I can tell you how it is today and how I'm hoping to get it in the in the next couple months. I will say this is where being a musician, especially one with an improvisatory background, has been an incredible gift to apply the things that I know as a musician to leadership has been marvelous. So I think there's as many ways to collaborate with people as there are people and contexts. And
Mm.
so I'm always looking to get the idea, the melody in the room, and then let people play with it. I think that's really, really important because we have the teams that we work with are filled with people with immense gifts, and we call it plussing. Like, how can we plus the work here? So the way it's working currently is that I'm a big believer in giving the team time to do their best work and direction. So I'll go away
Okay.
for 2 nights a quarter and we'll come up with the scripture and the themes. Usually we're lectionary. Occasionally we'll do a sermon series or two and come up with the central themes of worship. And I'll put them on a big table document and
Nice.
have like scripture, theme, what's happening in the life of the church, what's happening in the life of the culture. Like, do we know of a baptism that's coming up? So it's all kind of in one place.
Right, right.
Then bring it back, kind of give the 30,000 foot view of this is where I'm thinking, and then everybody go do your thing, and then we check back. We work kind of about a month out in our weekly meetings. We're looking for big picture things, and then down to the nuts and bolts logistics,
Yeah, yeah.
and those places. So, and there's been times too when I've found something that I thought was going to be better a month or two out, and be like, hey, this this makes more sense. What do y'all think? Does this is this getting to our people? Is this things that they need? But what I'm really wanting to do is to expand the our worship teams um, impact and insight earlier in the ideation process.
Okay.
So the goal
Okay.
for this year in the fall is to take them on a 2-night retreat where
Ah.
we get together and we have lots of butcher paper and spread, throw it out there, and then really plan together of like, what are you hearing from your people? What and the folks that you are pastoring in your children's ministry or youth ministry and music ministry, and then to be able to have that ideation phase start with some more people in it. So like it's easy for me to get locked into the things that I really like to talk about. That's
Hmm.
not always what needs to happen. So in some sense, I sort of view it as being like a benevolent band leader, right? Like we're going to get this thing going, and then let's see what everyone brings to it. And so I really try hard to maintain kind of a radical openness to the way in which the Spirit may be speaking through other people,
Hmm.
which sometimes is hard. But I've got exceptional colleagues who are gifted and different from one another, and they bring ideas to the table and solutions, and we workshop stuff together in ways that, if left to my own devices, I would probably be like, here's a decision, here's a decision, here's a decision. But it's always better when we have a group consensus and we workshop things and work them out. So to me, that
Right.
collaboration piece is really some of the most joyful work over the course of the week for me.
Yeah, yeah. I love it that you're allowing time for these things and you're paying more attention to sort of the time, maybe the growth of an idea, giving it a little more time to ripen, or maybe to add to a color to the masterpiece that's developing. I don't know,
Yep,
whatever metaphor you want to jump on.
sure.
Uh,
And I'll say that that too has come like, gosh, a couple of months ago. We were, no, gosh, it was even like a month or two ago. We were looking at some scriptures that I had selected for a series out of the lectionary, and as we got closer to it, the language of political or the violence in our political language kept increasing, and these texts were complicated. It's like King David stuff, and
yeah,
we
yeah.
sort of looked at each other and said, we got to go in a different direction here because we don't have the time to really break down
Oh,
what this is about.
okay,
And so,
okay.
we're launching a capital campaign in 3 weeks. And, you know, so
Okay.
we went to, so all that to say together, we decided we're going to go in a little bit different direction.
Sure, sure. Yeah.
And it was great. And I think so. So sometimes the idea comes to fruition, sometimes it dies on the vine, and sometimes that's for the best.
And that's okay. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. And that's
absolutely.
okay. If you
Mhm.
have
Good.
enough time
Yeah.
to have an appropriate alternative
Yes.
without it feeling like it was uh, rushed, rushed to
Right.
rushed to market, if you will, to use that kind of language.
Totally.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Well, we've sort of stayed on the positive mostly, but let's at least spend a minute with the reality that we are human beings and we see the world and work and life differently. We bring our own family stories to relationships.
Mhm.
What do you think are some of the sources of friction between pastors and church musician? Can we just name a few of those?
Yeah, it's definitely. I feel them internally sometimes.
Okay.
Um, and we'll get worked up at meetings if I feel like people aren't paying attention to the music the right way. So yeah, it's like an internal discussion sometimes for me.
That's
Um,
interesting. Yeah.
yeah, it's great. I think sometimes we either misunderstand our motivations and the motivations of the other, or we do not attribute them generously.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Like, oh, well, you're only really concerned is having a full choir loft that sounds good and you're making music that looks good for your colleagues, or you're just trying to get butts and seats in the pews, or, and really, for most people aren't monsters, So not dealing generously with one another in our hearts, I think is a
Hmm.
challenge. And I will say too, I've seen this on both sides, and I think our seminaries do our clergy a pretty significant disservice
Hmm.
by most MDiv curriculums only having one mandatory worship class, and some they don't have a
Right.
worship class.
Right. Right. right.
So the one thing that they do every week in front of people,
Yeah.
they have no training on, but lots of opinions. And I know that that can be really challenging as a church musician. I remember one senior pastor telling me, well, like he said, he was a track star in high school. We were talking about needing to schedule enough time for me to warm the choir up before the service. He's like, you can't convince me that the choir needs to be warmed up. You guys just show up and sing. I was like, when you were in high school, did you warm up your muscles? It's muscles, So, sometimes I think we have those. Just, I'll be honest, it's mostly my clergy siblings that I experience this from, who just like they just don't know, but they have a lot of opinions, and that's tough to be gracious with.
At the risk of piling on, I once worked with a
Sure. Yeah.
pastor who who really a lovely individual, but
Sure.
he had such limited understandings about music. The only thing he could ever ask for is, well, I just want it to be more upbeat.
Mhm.
I heard that word so much. I developed a tick.
Right.
Now, if I
Yeah,
had
you kind
probably
of want
been
to
a
like
little,
just hand him a metronome. Is this what you mean? Is this like
yeah, that was probably a little too snarky, Joe.
yeah.
I tended to like my paycheck, but
Right, right. Yeah.
there's
Well,
that. There's
no
that.
disrespect to
But
the love.
all that's to say, yeah, I mean, it wasn't a malicious kind of thing. It was he didn't know how to describe what he
Right.
wanted, and then we could have had a better conversation. That's probably, well, I guess that does contribute to this question. What are some other sources of friction you've observed that you think we ought to just at least name
Yeah,
between pastors and church musicians? Yeah.
sure. Um, I've seen this. I've never been in this place. I'm very thankful for which where but I've seen this certainly in other contexts where um the church musician and the senior pastor both have something of a messiah complex and think they're the only ones that could possibly fix what's going on. And the humility and vulnerability in the relationship is just completely wiped away. And then I know one particular context where they had to bring in a professional mediator.
Oh,
Like
wow.
that is not an avenue to the gospel.
Right,
I think
right.
humility is something that is important to model in such a way that we're not getting stepped on. I think too also sort of unvoiced expectations. I think that
Hmm.
communication is a real challenge sometimes between people, and especially between folks who have one set of professional expertise and jargon and all that comes with it,
Right, right.
and then another that has a different set, but they're working together, which could be a really beautiful model for the reign of God. Um, but I think that's something that's tricky. We just don't actually we're not speaking clearly to each other from a place that's not frustration.
Right, 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 right. Is any other things you would add in the realm of how might we resolve differences when they occur? You already sort of alluded to that a little bit. What do you other thoughts out of your experience, and maybe even a story if you have one? Did you ever have a time where you were able to resolve a difference?
Well, yes. This
I
is
don't want
maybe
to put you on the
yeah,
spot.
no, it's fine. It's a funny story only, and it's so silly. It's sometimes you just have to come out and be clear in in your communication. So I had a senior pastor who one Saturday night called me at 9:30, and she said, "I've had this
AM or PM? I guess
PM,
PM, yeah.
yeah, PM," and he said, "The Spirit's been at work. I'm preaching on something different. I've thought of these anthems the choir could sing. So I want to be a team player." She says, "The Spirit's at work. That's awesome." So I picked one of those, and we had a real quick rehearsal and knocked it out the next day. And then the next Saturday night, the same thing happened. And I said, "Well, it takes us like 6 weeks to really put an
Right,
anthem
right.
pedal." But I found something that worked. And then the third week she called.
No.
Yes. And so I, at that point, was like, I said, "Well, I really appreciate that the Holy Spirit's been working in you and in your homiletical process. And I also trust that the Holy Spirit has been at work in these rehearsals we've had for the 6 months or 6 weeks to get to what we're going to sing in the morning. And so I'm going to trust that the Holy Spirit is going to fill in the gap. Have a nice evening." And then I hung up. And that I never got that Saturday call again. And we had a lot better conversation about how do we respect each other. So
Wow.
it was
Wow.
it was a little tense Sunday morning, but it came
Yeah,
out
go
okay.
figure.
Yeah, right. Yeah, maybe I would say that somewhat differently now. But yeah, I think that's a piece of it, is that we really need to communicate with each other. And the trust piece is huge. Like had I known, I had the slight inkling that she would fire me the next day. No way I'm saying that, right? So
Right.
like we
Okay.
had enough of
Okay.
a relationship to where I could be honest with her and be like, we can't keep doing this.
Right.
And then we had a good conversation and it never happened again. So I think that's a piece of it. Um, and then being willing to try some things on both sides.
Okay.
We're not in the place, if we ever really were, where like we can just keep doing the same things we've been doing, whether that's in homiletics, liturgics, liturgical music. Like we've got to be willing to try some things. And if there's a sense of being able to try those things together, we got a shared sense of exploration, a shared sense of what is the new thing God is doing. Not only do we build trust with one another, but we also have like a collective ethics and a collective responsibility of how we're moving together. So
Mhm.
if you know what it is, everybody's got some skin in the game. So I
Yeah.
think that's something important as well. I mean, I think trust is just such a big part of it. Being willing to be appropriately vulnerable, spending some time together, go out to lunch,
Mhm.
that sort of stuff. Just be humans together. And there are some people who are monsters, but most people aren't.
Right. 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 Right.
Mhm.
You uh, occasionally church musicians become resistant to new ideas actually because of their own insecurities, maybe
Yes.
being asked to lean into a style that's not
Mm,
really in their wheelhouse.
sure.
As senior pastor, if a church musician could be brave enough to be vulnerable with you
Yeah.
about what's really underneath their resistance,
Yes.
what would be helpful for them to say to you to move through that together? I mean,
Yeah.
for instance, do I understand you really have a pretty strong jazz background?
Yeah, I would say probably maybe more improvisational than straight
Yeah,
jazz. But yes, yeah, yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Uh-huh,
yeah, yeah,
sure.
yeah, 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 yeah. But there are a lot of very fine musicians who
Yes.
really do not do
That's
that
not
at
their thing
all.
at all.
I mean,
Yes.
frankly, it's actually terrifying.
Yes. Yeah, I get that. Hmm.
And so, but if a musician were, if you did have a relationship with a musician and they were able to say, I'm sorry, I just don't know how to do that. I mean,
Yeah.
what would be your response to that sort of dialogue?
My response would be thank you. I like from a genuine place. I appreciate their willingness to share that because that takes a lot of guts and a lot of courage. And those music degrees are expensive and hard won. So I,
Yeah,
I get that. And I would be thankful that they were willing to say, I can't do that thing in the way right now, in the way in which I think you want it to happen. And so I think my initial response, outside being grateful that we're having a real conversation,
right.
as opposed to like, you won't believe what this jerk is asking me to do, and just getting the choir fired up or
Yeah,
whatever, like we can have,
right.
yeah. So I think my second thought would be like, all right, well, what what are some solutions to this?
Okay. Okay.
And invite them in the process. So like maybe it's there's a continuing ed option if they wanted to, if they were like, I don't know how to do this, but I'd like to get some ideas around it. All right, well, let's find somebody who could help with that. Or if they're like, this is just like, I just know in my heart of hearts this is not for me. Well then, okay,
Yeah.
let's let's talk about that. And what are there workarounds? Are there people in our congregation who know how to do this that we can empower? I'm also too, like, I'm a really big believer that life is pretty complex, and that also contextual ministry is what it's about. So I know, like when I've taught creativity classes, like, hey, if you've got a bluegrass group in your church and they're really good, well, God's given you a gift. So go with that.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think too, sometimes we get into this idea of like music ministry, we're not being faithful if it's not A, B, or C things in its purest way, purest form. And I just don't think that's healthy or reasonable.
Right. 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 Right.
Especially in the season I think most of us are finding ourselves in.
Right.
So
Right. 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 Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think too, yeah, just like a little bit of alleviation of the pressure. Like nobody can do everything well. And so
Right.
how do
That's
we
so
play to the
true.
strengths that we have? Mhm.
Yeah. 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 So we probably need to begin to think
Sure.
about landing this plane on the runway. This has been such a great conversation. I do want to ask you, going back to paint a picture of what is a positive, productive, and trusting working relationship. Well, what does that look like?
Yeah. For me, it's someone who's passionate, two people who are passionate about what they're doing.
Mhm.
For the senior
Mhm.
leader to be passionate about the church, and for the church leaders to be passionate about the church, and also like the music ministry, and to advocate for it and to want the best for their ministry. I think that's really important. I know as a pastor, I want people who I want to serve with people who care and
Yeah.
who are excited about it and have thoughts and want to then go execute on those thoughts, and then to be able to create a safe space through the building of trust and sharing personal personal vulnerability is so important to create those kind of places where like you can come in and say, man, that was a bad idea, or or hey, this was great, what do you think about this, how here's another way of looking at that, where the musician knows that the pastor's not going to bite their head off, and the
Mhm.
pastor knows the musician's coming in with like really good intent
Mhm.
and probably has some ideas that you haven't thought of. And like
Right,
that's a
right,
great
right.
gift. I mean, I really would lean into the Imago Dei, like from a theological standpoint of like
Nice.
we we're made in the image of God, and I believe every person has a unique part of the image of God within them. And even on the days when we're irritated with each other, we can still love the Christ that's in that person, you know?
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
so and what is the church missing if we're not able to treat each other with dignity and freedom
Mhm.
and respect? I'm a big
Lovely.
believer in Ubuntu, that we're only ever free. Like I can only ever be the person God's made me to be when you can
Right.
be the person that God's made you to be. And so for that to happen, for the
Mhm.
church to flourish, for individuals to flourish, for communities to flourish, we all have a big part in that, and no one person has all the answers. And so
Mm.
humility, openness, vulnerability, those are all, in my estimation, really important. I want to create a place where people can come in and bring their best, and we can laugh and experience joy and take initiative and keep each other accountable and always keep the bigger picture of what we're doing in mind.
Wow, wow. So beautifully said, Joe. Thank you. I mean, that's really a beautiful summation of our conversation today. And I'm so grateful for your time. And I know our colleagues far and wide, and when I say colleagues, I mean pastors, senior pastors, and church musicians alike, will gain much from this conversation, and maybe just taking a step back and reflecting on their own current working relationship and how that could be healthier, and how in turn that health might flow over into the health and the life of the congregation, which is what we all dream of, right? Right.
Flourishing. Mhm.
Yeah. Well, I'm so grateful for your time today, and it's been so much fun to get to know you.
Likewise.
We had sort of commented that we were both in Dallas all those years, but the folks who've not lived in Dallas don't understand what a divide Central Expressway is.
Boy, it is. Hmm.
That's a
Hmm.
little insider baseball, but anyway, it's great to meet you on Zoom, and I hope we get a chance to meet in person at some point.
Thank
So
you for the
thank you for
privilege of being a
being
part of this.
thank you for being part of our Polyphony community, and
Blessings.
blessings on you as you continue the leadership and the role in which you serve.
Likewise, and on the important work that you're doing and the Polyphony's doing, and aren't we blessed to be able to do this work together? Yeah.
Indeed, indeed, indeed. And so, friends, breathe, bless, and be well.